All right, and we're recording. So hey Tripp, I think we've interacted on the Discord server a little bit, but we've never talked face or screen to screen before.
Yes.
So you came out on Paul's channel today, but you've been kind of around. You've been on that video with Esther before. Was that kind of the first video of that you put out?
I think that's probably the first one. Yeah, I've done other I've done other things in terms of editing books and online articles and that kind of stuff for various publications, but that was the first one that I actually ever did where it was a live discussion. So yeah, so the one with Adam and Esther was kind of my first foray into that. Again, I have a day job, so this is not
right.
this is just a hobby of mine. So yeah, so I think probably the first one with Adam and Esther and I, because I like both of them and they're both friends of mine, was the first one that I did, and then Paul we recorded that a little while ago, and then he posted it today, and then I think he and I and Esther are going to do one in the future on Vervaki. So
that's fun. How'd you get to know Adam and Esther?
Adam, I got to know honestly just through Twitter. I found his video series on one of my big problems with the new atheists is that they're not scientific.
Right.
And a lot of their criticisms of religion, it's not just that, like, if you stop that it's not true, we can disagree, but I kind of get where you're coming at. But a lot of the new atheists say, well, it's not only not true, but it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very not scientific way of looking at this problem, because of its. So Brett Weinstein gave a really good definition, I think, of what's adaptive, or a good test of telling what's adaptive. And what he said was, okay, if what you're saying is costly, if a particular trait is costly, it's persistent, and it's complex, then it's adaptive. It has to be.
Right.
Because evolution would have weeded that out a long time ago. And so you think about religion, you say, well, is it costly? Well, yeah, it's costly. Yeah. Like you tithe, you go to church, you dedicate time and money and all kinds of things to the religion that you're adhering to. So yeah, it's costly for sure. Okay. Is it complex? It's very complex. It can't be boiled down to a single gene mutation or anything else like that. So it's complex. And it's persistent. It hasn't, it's been around for a while,
right.
However we find it. So it's adaptive. And so what I liked about Adam's channel was he was just saying, hey, I'm an atheist, but what do you want me to do? Like, this can't be bad. In that kind of sense. And so I felt like he was an honest actor.
Yeah.
And so we started interacting on Twitter about that. And Esther, I found through her first article that I found of hers was when she wrote, Sam Harris asks questions that Jordan Peterson can't answer. And that went kind of viral, and Jordan Peterson retweeted it and said this was a good article and that kind of stuff. And so that's how I found Esther. And so again, we started interacting over Twitter and that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of how I got in touch with both of them. Was honestly just through finding their content and interacting with them online. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. I saw Brett Weinstein not debated, kind of had a discussion with Richard Dawkins in Chicago. And I'm not sure if that ever made it to YouTube. I think they might have botched the recording, or someone put up
I think that they got, yeah, I think that they got that whole like scam. That sorry, my dog just barked. I think that they got that whole scam.
What was
Where that company that was doing
Pangburn?
stuff. Yeah, Pangburn. That recorded it. And it did end up making it. I don't know to YouTube, but it didn't end up making it out. So I've watched it, but yeah, it took a long time.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, Brett basically got Richard to admit that that religion must be in some sense adaptive and some sense effective.
I don't know how you could say anything other than that from a scientific standpoint. Yeah.
And I would also add to when discussing humans, if it's like universal or culturally widespread across very different kinds of cultures, then that also seems to suggest that it's adaptive too.
Exactly. At some point, you're just like, well, if every culture exhibits these same impulses and that kind of stuff, then at some point you can't say that it's bad because it would have been weeded out. If it's really maladaptive, if it's really bad for us as a species, then why would
Right.
why would it last this long? So yeah, no, I totally agree. And so that's why I like Adam's channel, because even though he's an atheist, he's trying to be honest about it.
Yeah.
I don't agree with him in a lot of ways, and obviously we come to very different conclusions. But I do think that he's trying to be honest, and so that's why I was like, I can talk to a guy like that, and Esther can as well, because he is being honest about it. So
Yeah. Yeah. And respectful to
no,
while having, yeah.
and he is the nicest guy. Just talking to him after, like before and after the video and offline and that kind of stuff, he's a genuinely respectful and good person. So I have no qualms talking with someone like that. It is really the definition of a good faith conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it showed that way listening to it too.
Good.
Even though you guys were a little bit cross-firing, I think.
Oh no, we were orthogonal in all kinds of ways for sure, and talking about it. But it was a good faith conversation. In the ways that we were orthogonal, it wasn't because of bad faith. It wasn't because we were trying to take the other person wrong. It was because we just weren't speaking the same language or meeting kind of eye to eye on some of the points that we're trying to make. But it wasn't bad faith. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, you maybe had slightly different expectations or something, but it was still worth listening to.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you and I do similar things professionally, which was part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you, not to just talk shop about work or something, but it seems like we probably have a lot in common and have some similar perspectives that way. So the subject that you and Paul talked about on the video that came out today is that, well, you guys covered a bunch of different things. Kind of right there in the middle, you were talking about personhood and agency and kind of free will sort of stuff, and how artificial intelligence and things fit into that. And I thought that was the most interesting to me of the subjects that you covered, but you kind of moved on relatively quickly. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking more about that sort of stuff.
Sure.
So I guess, so I commented on your video right before I messaged you about, do you think that all of our agency, all of our free will, or all of our decision making can be boiled down to the brain, essentially? Or do you think that as Christians, we need to maintain some sort of metaphysical or supernatural component, like a soul or a spirit or something?
So it's a hard question for me, because so as you probably realize from the video, I'm a Thomist, and so saying boiled down to the brain is a little bit confusing,
Mm-hmm.
because in the Thomistic, like Aristotelian framework, matter in itself is, I'm gonna go back to Peterson. Matter in itself is chaos. Matter without form is chaos. And so, saying, can you boil down the soul or whatever to the brain, doesn't really make sense, because the brain as just matter, no, that's not something that actually, it doesn't. So I think that, and this is my problem with Vervaeke, and this is something that I think that Esther and I and Paul will probably talk about, is just because you can describe what's going on in your brain, and say, well, this corresponds to a mind state, doesn't mean that the brain produces the mind state. This is a non sequitur. You need more premises in order to make that statement. And so I don't think that you can say, well, boiling it down to the mind state, that's all we are. That's a reductionist view, and I very much don't agree with it. And so in the Thomistic standpoint, you're like, no, actually the matter is behaving according to the form that it is. And so in a Thomistic in a Thomistic framework, you would say, actually, the soul is the primary substance, not the matter. Because you would say, for instance, that is your brain.
Right.
It's your. So like, and Aristotelian argumentation and Aquinas would say, well, we use the subject predicate language for a reason, because it actually gives us some information about the real world. And so if I can't attribute the predicate to the proper subject, then that means I have the wrong subject. And so the consciousness, like the soul, can't be the predicate of the brain, because what does that mean? But I can say that is your brain, that is your arm. But what is your? It's not the arm's arm. It's not your body's arm. It's your arm. And so the you is a non-physical thing, because how could it be anything other than that? Because your body is the matter that composes your body is changing constantly, right?
Yeah.
Like minute to minute, second to second, the matter, the atoms that make up your body are changing. And so you cannot say that the predicate, consciousness or your arm or whatever, is subject to the subject, or can be ascribed to the subject of matter, because the matter is constantly changing. So we need something else. We need some other thing metaphysically that it can be anchored to if we're going to make sense of this. And so that's you, that's your soul. And so that's your primary substance. And so that's where I would go with it. And so no, I wouldn't say you can have your brain emanates, or your soul emanates from your brain. No, however, that's where it's instantiated. That's where it is. And so it's intertwined. It's a composite substance in the Aristotelian framework. It's not something that exists outside of it, but also it is also primary. And so that's where I think that in modern terms it's hard to describe, but I think that is the best way of talking about these things.
Yeah, I think that certainly is part of it, is what would the thing that is the I that's talking, the I that's the subject of this sentence, preside, right? Like, and it seems to be that often the way we think about this, whether this is right or wrong, is that there's really no, like, we can't do a brain scan and say, oh, there's the part of you that's the subject of your own sentences or something like that.
Yes, how could you do that? Yeah.
Right. But part of me wonders is that I think that that's why a lot of hardcore materialists like Sam Harris will say that the self is an illusion or something like that, is
Mhm.
we're unable, or unable now or unable ever is an interesting question, to point at the thing that is the subject of sentences or something like that.
Well, that's the thing. I think categorically, if you eliminate anything but the material, you would not ever have something to point to.
Yeah.
I don't think that categorically that's like saying, 1 + 1 = orange. There's nothing there. Like there's no way to get there if that's what you're reducing it to. And so I don't think that there's any way to make that leap. I think that you could go, to the Sam Harris and say, yeah, the self isn't a thing.
Yeah. But then who is the self deluding?
That's my thing. That's my thing. And so that's the, and Harris will occasionally admit some parts of that where he'll say, well, yes, of course I can't act like that.
Right.
Of course I can't, like, if my kid, wants to do something or whatever, and I'm trying to teach them something, I have to act as if there's a self there. I have
Yeah.
to act like you could do other than what your brain is doing.
Yeah.
And I have a strong kind of bias toward if your theory cannot be acted out in the world, it's a wrong theory. If it
Right.
cannot be, and this is kind of almost like the basis of science. If you have a theory that I cannot act out in the world, that I cannot experiment on and act as if it's true,
Mm-hmm.
then I think your theory is probably wrong.
Right. It just
That's
gets
my
kind of topsy-turvy and paradoxical when your theory is about yourself.
right. No, it totally is. But I have a strong bias that if you're giving me a theory and you're saying this is true, but don't act as if it's true or it will totally not work.
Right.
I don't know. I feel like you're probably giving me a bullshit theory. That's my bias. That was part of my master's. So a part of my thesis at Duke was about mental causation, and so the first part of it was just showing how our existing models of mental causation is, like, in particular the material, is missing information. And it's missing information about what we're trying, like what is being done, the telos, the end goal, and all those kind of things. And so all these things are information as part of what's being done. And so I made that case, and I'm in front of this panel and everything else, and so they're saying, okay, but why? And so like, we buy it totally. You made a compelling case that our existing material model of the brain is missing information about what's going on. You have not made the case, though, that that just because you're missing information, that therefore we're missing a causal mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so what I said, so my response to that, because I kind of anticipated, was I said, isn't that the assumption of all of science? Is that if I'm missing information, so take the wave and light, so take light, for example. If I told you I have a model of light that treats it as a particle, and I run these experiments, and it looks like it's a particle, totally working. And then I have another experiment that treats it as and it looks like it's acting as a wave and not a particle. That's additional information about the light.
Yeah.
So doesn't that suggest to us that our model is wrong?
Right.
That additional information about how about the system itself is in fact wrong.
Is sufficient to to make the case that we don't understand causation.
Exactly. And so that additional information, which no one denies, is in itself, to me, proof that the reductionistic model of material brain as being the entirety of mind is itself wrong. And I don't know how else to get away with that without throwing out all of science. I don't know how you get away with that.
That's interesting. Was this a philosophy master's or a cognitive science or what were?
So I had a very interesting program. It was a philosophy of mind, so master's in philosophy of mind, but then computer science and computer engineering was also a lot of my curriculum. So I took a lot of
Interesting.
A lot of that. It was kind of like, it was a very unique program, and I studied under Owen Flanagan at Duke. And so he was a chair in both philosophy. He was a chair of the philosophy department, but he was also a chair of the neuroscience department. And so I took neuroscience and cognitive science and a kind of a proto version of evolutionary psychology. But then I got a Bachelor of Science and Engineering degree in computer engineering, computer science. And doing that because I wanted to see how would we build something that approximates the human brain, and all the things that it could do. And so, like, I grew up I'm really into sci-fi, and so I like Star Trek, and I wanted to build the Star Trek computer, right? Yeah. And so that's what I wanted to do, and so that was my background, and so that's what I wrote my thesis in that. But then my degree is in my engineering degree is in computer science and computer engineering, and that's what I do professionally. So.
Okay, so do you think you can build a self, or whatever your favorite word is for that?
No, I mean I don't see. I'm not totally confident, but I don't think so. I don't think that it is that kind of. I don't think that I can. I think that I can build something that's very deterministic. I think that I could build something that would pass the Turing test. I don't think that I could build something that actually has anything approaching real agency.
So let me tell you about something that I'm working on that I think might be something like that has something like the kernel of agency in it, but okay. I'm not quite sure if this is what we mean by agency or not.
Okay.
So I work at a hospital right now, and I'm a data scientist.
Where are you working?
In the suburbs of Chicago. It's a hospital system called North Shore University Health System. Although I should say that I actually only have 2 more weeks at that job. I'm actually switching. but one of the projects that I worked on, so I mainly do data science and predictive modeling stuff for neurology. So a patient comes in, they're a new migraine patient. They've never taken medications for migraine before, and they just started experiencing them or whatever. So we record a couple pieces of information about them, like their symptoms, and run a couple tests and stuff like that. And so we have a predictive model that has seen a bunch of patients like that before. And there are 3 medications, basically, that are the common preventative treatments for migraine, right? So it's making the decision between 3 options. And we call each patient 6 months afterwards and say, basically, did this medication work for you, yes or no? Right? So we have a data set that is variables about each patient, which medication they were given, did it work, yes or no? And so we run this through some sort of kind of like a Bayesian random forest sort of model. And so we have a probability that each drug has the best chance of success. Like, say it's like an 80% chance of drug A, 15% chance drug B, 5% chance that drug C has the highest probability of success.
Right.
And then it flips a coin, a weighted coin, based off of those probabilities, like a 80-15-5 sort of random number, pseudo-random number. And then it gives the patient that drug. And then every time we get a new outcome, we add it to the data set and retrain the thing so that it's getting, it's being trained off of a larger and larger data set.
Sure.
And that sort of adaptive assignment, as it's called, you can show mathematically that that's, under most conditions, the fastest way to learn, right? It's like part of the way between randomization and part of the way between pure determinism. But is that an agent, right? Because it's not pure determinism, right? There is some randomness that's happening within, the some computer server somewhere, or pseudo randomness, or basically using the time on the clock and generating a random number from it, and using that to probabilistically pick one of the medications. Is that an agent?
I think that, again, like I would go back to Aristotle's kind of linguistic analysis. What would you ascribe the agency to?
Right.
Who has the agency here?
So some computer code saved on memory and all of the wires and microchips and whatever that connect all of that process together.
And that's the problem. There's no subject that would have a will.
Right.
That could like make a decision. And so it still seems like the atheist could say, well, that's still determinism. It's just it's complex enough that you don't know what the deterministic outcome will be, but that doesn't mean it's not deterministic. That just means it's complicated, And so in all those kind of questions, you would say, I would ask, okay, if we're going to say this is a person, if we're going to say this is conscious, if we're going to say that, and this came up in Esther and I conversation with Adam, is that, he was talking about, consciousness in a computer simulation, right? And he was talking about people playing a game and that kind of stuff. And so I brought up, well, there's a subject predicate problem. Like you wouldn't ascribe the consciousness, which would be the predicate, to the subject, the computer. You would ascribe it to the person playing the computer game, the video game, that kind of stuff. And so in this case, like, what would we ascribe the agency to? Well, it's not the electron. It's not the bit that's sitting in the computer. It's not the wire that's sitting in the computer or anything else like that. So is there any real agency? And so that's where it becomes like a little fuzzy for me, where I don't know of a way of building agency inside of these systems in a way that's not easily described as determinism. And so you can add randomness, you can add complexity, you can add unpredictability, but those in themselves, a hurricane is unpredictable. We wouldn't say it's an agent in the same way.
So even if instead of using, pseudo randomness, even if it were hooked up to like, some sort of quantum, indeterminacy thing, where it was, well, depending on your view of quantum mechanics, as indeterminate as you think quantum mechanics is.
Right.
Even then, so it's not just determinism that makes something not an agent.
Yeah, I think that quantum mechanics gets weird because we don't really know what's going on.
And I am no expert in quantum mechanics.
No, and I have a cursory knowledge, but I'm not an expert either. But I don't think that I don't think anyone really knows what's going on with quantum mechanics. And so I'm not willing to say that quantum mechanics is incompatible with agency or or incompatible with determinism either. Because I honestly don't think that we know what's going on. And so, yeah, I guess it's weird to me that, yeah, I guess I don't know how to answer that particular question, um, except to say, if there's no subject that could do differently
Mm-hmm.
given the inputs,
Mm-hmm.
then we're in a deterministic system.
Right. Well, and then it does get weird if it does have real indeterminism right in the core of its decision making apparatus, because
Right.
it could have picked medication B instead of medication A.
Correct.
We have a probability of how often it will do these things, but yet
Yeah.
it's something inside it, the machine algorithm thingy, that is responsible. Like, right? That almost seems like the right.
In your case, it would be a non-conscious aid. It would be a non-conscious component that's making
Sure.
that determination. And
Yeah.
so that's where it becomes less of an agent and more of a variable.
Right.
Right? Because we
Right.
could easily think about that component as being outside of the system itself,
Mm-hmm.
and it itself being an input variable.
Right.
Right. And so
Right.
then it becomes very deterministic. And so if it's something that is not um, easily separable from the system, that is not something that is kind of determined, like, yeah, I guess that's my thing. The random variable introduction into a machine learning system doesn't in itself make it an agent. Because one could easily conceptualize that as being outside of it, and you could make that an outside variable if you wanted to,
Yeah.
and train the model that way. And so that's where I don't think that you would say, well, it's an agent now, because it's not strictly deterministic, but it's kind of deterministic as a model. It's just that we have this one random variable that changes.
Right.
Um, and so that's not a will, that's not an intellect, that's not a consciousness. That's a random number generator.
Right.
And
So
that's all it is.
I think the interesting thing is that randomness in those sorts of models and that sort of iterative process, right, where we have one patient after the other, and we're hoping to get better by the time we see our, 1,000th patient compared to our 500th patient, is the weird thing is that randomness helps it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Randomness is useful, right?
Oh.
And randomness is kind of at the core of how we do experiments.
Mm-hmm.
There's this weird sort of thing, and it's sort of like that Jordan Peterson, chaos is the source from which all structure comes.
Yep.
It's like, if you can figure out a structure that can properly leverage randomness, it can learn faster than a structure that can incorporate randomness.
Sure. No, I mean, I completely agree. And just from an engineering perspective, that's spot on. And from a psychological perspective, I think that the 1 foot in order, 1 foot in chaos is
Right.
kind of way of living. Yeah, I think the big difference is the randomness in terms of outcome coming from consciousness, from like real introspection, or is it not?
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of machine learning stuff, it's not. It is very clearly not. And in terms of us, I mean, think about it. When, like, redness doesn't exist in the world, like the color red does not exist in the world. It's not a property of anything.
Mm-hmm.
It is an experience that you have,
Right.
because light reflects off of surfaces with a certain wavelength, and then it hits your eye, and then it goes into your brain, and then you experience this qualia, is what David Chalmers calls it, this qualia of
Mm-hmm.
red, this quality, the subjective
Yeah.
quality that can't be reduced to wavelength or anything else. It's a categorically different thing. Redness.
Mm-hmm.
machine learning systems never get past
Right.
the wavelength. They never do. And so it seems to me that we're jumping the gun and saying because they can learn and they can mimic some of the same intelligence and learning algorithms and that kind of stuff that like humans are, you know, good at, and maybe even surpass us in a lot of cases. And they can, by introducing randomness, we can mimic even more of what the human brain does and that kind of stuff. That's great. They never get past that categorical difference of experiencing that qualia.
Right. 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 I would never describe that model that I just explained as conscious. I
No.
also, I'm not a panpsychist either. A panpsychist would be like, well, kind of.
Yeah.
Sorry, panpsychist. I know that you're actually more serious than that. But is agency does agency require consciousness, or do you think that those can be separated out? Like simple, like say a bee or something like that, right? I'm sure bees are making decisions, kind of, and that they probably have probabilistic models inside them that tell them where to go look for honey and stuff like that, or nectar. But I'm not sure if a bee is conscious. So it seems to me like agency and consciousness might be separate things.
Yeah, I think that I mean, that's a good point. I think that there's certain like gray areas of sentience and consciousness that it's hard to tease out to a certain extent. I would definitely ascribe some degree of consciousness to things other than human.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would not say that we're the only ones that are conscious. Everyone else, like, they're just automatons and they're basically just biological machines. I don't believe that. I don't think that that's right. And I don't think that Aquinas or Aristotle would believe that either.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, I mean, to what degree they're conscious, to what degree they're sentient, to what degree are they just reducible down to kind of the neurons that are going on and that kind of stuff in their brain, to what degree they're deterministic. I think it's an interesting question. To a certain degree, I'm deterministic.
Yeah.
Like you sit a box of Oreos down in front of me, I'm gonna eat all of them.
Yeah.
And so to a degree, I'm deterministic too. And so I don't know to what degree I'm willing to say a bee or a dog or whatever it is or is not conscious. I do think that some degree of introspection and sentience is needed for agency. And if you do not have that, then you do not really have agency.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, I don't think that we could build a machine learning system that has agency, because it's not clear to me how we would ever introduce the variable of consciousness or sentience or introspection into it in a way that's not deterministic.
Yeah. And it also seems impossible to know if we've ever done so.
Right. How would you?
We're stuck in Turing tests and
exactly.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of people misunderstand about the Turing test. What Turing wasn't saying, Turing was not saying that if you pass this test, therefore you're conscious.
Right.
What
right,
it said was, I have no reason to suspect that you're not conscious.
right.
If you pass this test. And so what he's saying is like, this is the only test we have. So I'm taking on faith in some sense that you're conscious and this machine is not.
Mm-hmm.
But I have no real empirical reason to believe that, other than kind of an like axiomatic starting point that I have. And that was his point. So yeah, I mean, we have no evidence that the machine is conscious, but I don't have like scientific proof that it's not either.
Mm-hmm.
How could you? How could you have scientific proof that the machine is not conscious? I don't have scientific proof that you're not conscious.
Right. I can't even think of a test that could do that.
No, exactly. And that's what was so interesting at the end of the conversation that I had with Adam and Esther was at the end, he's like, I have no evidence that there's no God. How could I? And I was
Right.
like, I completely agree, Adam. How could you? It's not the kind of thing that you can prove. Or you can have evidence of that nature to start with. And it's the same thing with consciousness. You can't have that kind of evidence that something is not conscious. That's not the kind of not scientific evidence. Not if we really like kind of narrow it down to that field. No.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So I sometimes think that things like bees, we'll stick with bees, probably have some way of incorporating randomness into their decision making. Because it seems like we can show mathematically, like I said earlier, that randomness improves the rate of learning. But it only improves the rate of learning if you get to experience the outcome of your previous decision. So you have something like memory, right? I did these couple things in the past. They ended up this way. Okay, so here I am now. And you have some way of classifying the outcome as good or bad, either binary or on some sort of numeric scale of quantity of goodness and badness. And if you can do those couple things, then randomness is useful for you to be able to explore the space of potential upside in your optimization algorithm based off of different actions in different circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about bees is that, you know, they have kind of a hive mind,
Right.
right? And so then it's not just their decisions; it's other bees' decisions and that kind of stuff, and it's
Right.
paired and that kind of stuff. And then you get into the evolutionary framework where you're like, well, they don't even necessarily need to learn; they just need to die out if it doesn't work.
Right.
And then like the ones that didn't have the genes that produced that behavior ended up, and so it becomes like this very strange discussion because the bees don't necessarily have to ever learn in the same way that a machine learning algorithm does,
Right.
because if they just die out and another beehive that has um, different genes that produce a different behavior ends up surviving
Mm-hmm.
because they have that behavior and the genes that produce that trait and all those kind of things. Um, you don't have to, it's not like a machine learning algorithm where it has to have a feedback loop. All we need to have is the thing to die in
Right.
order for the right answer to survive. And so it's almost like we don't need a feedback loop. We just need a bajillion machine learning systems with a bajillion different models, and then we'll just see which one
Right.
survives.
Or, well, survival is the feedback.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. But it's outside of even the system itself, right?
Yeah.
That system never gets that feedback loop because it's dead by the time it would have gotten that signal.
Right.
And there's no time to react. And so it is interesting because it is very different in talking about these things than what we do, because we're looking to build systems that get feedback loops,
Yeah.
that get data. We train with data, but then we get more data and it improves and improves and improves. But that's not how biology works, really. That's not how the evolutionary framework works. You die. That's it.
Or like, you know, humans get a lot of feedback, right? Like pleasure and pain is non-death feedback.
Sure,
And
but yes. So like within a limited like scope, you get some feedback and you change your behavior, and so you have some wiggle room and that kind of stuff. But like the big thing, you're pretty much stuck. You like sugar.
right.
Like like there's some things that are kind of like baked into the cake with you, and you're never going to get out of.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and
That's
so
true of our models too, right? They only have the shape they do, and the hyperparameters and all those things are set at the settings.
right,
So,
yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely true. I think that it is interesting to see to think about the parallels between kind of biological evolution and machine learning algorithms. I just think that we have way more flexibility with machine learning algorithms to be like, we're gonna introduce feedback loops whenever we see that there's a problem, that we're not getting the proper signal back into the model.
Yeah.
In ways that biology just doesn't have, because it evolves too slowly, and so that thing
Right.
just going extinct.
And I think part of it is that our algorithms have the safety of us, right?
Yes,
We are giving them their survival. They're not dependent on themselves.
we're consciously looking at it and be like, well, it didn't take this particular, so we need to adjust it in this way and that kind of stuff. But biology doesn't have that. You just die.
Right.
That's what happens. Yeah.
And I think in nature, you can kind of see that there's a relationship between safety, or the amount of time that that organism spends in a safe environment, and the amount that it's able to learn. And I think that there's an interesting lesson about what parenthood is in that we're sort of like this wall that mediates between reality and our children. And part of the purpose of that is to let them learn. And one of the roles as parents is to give feedback to our children. Like when they do something good, we praise them. When they do something bad, we don't. And part of that is we're like reality simulators, where we're taking the harsher outcome that's in the reality and translating it into a softer form of feedback, so that children can learn until they have to be the ones facing reality themselves.
Yeah, and the problem, the danger as a parent is that you remove too much of the negative feedback to protect your kids.
Right.
And so that's why I like Jonathan Haidt's. He's involved in that the organization called Let Grow.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like the free range parenting kind of thing. Like, let your kids go and experience interacting with other kids and playgrounds and that kind of stuff without the comfort of you kind of helicopter parenting them. For that reason, is because our bias is to protect our kids from those things.
Right.
And just like in a machine learning algorithm, if you do that, if you soften the negative feedback loops,
right, they won't learn as well, or they will underestimate the downside risk of certain decisions.
Exactly. And so that's what but that's our bias as parents, right, is to protect them from that. But what we're really doing is exposing them to more and more danger in the future from making those decisions based on what they learn. And it's harder down the line to overcome those built-in biases after the training.
Right.
Those feedback loops come harder and harder after more and more training happens.
Right.
So
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that there's something softer about us when we're kids, right? Than when we're adults. Like we can learn now, but we sort of more learn like intellectual, propositional sort of stuff. A lot of our habits and our ethical codes and stuff like that, that's probably relatively set.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you change a lot. You change a lot less between, say, 25 and 30 than you do between 18 and, 23.
Right.
And you can, I don't think that, by the time you're 50, 60, like you're pretty much set in your ways, and we all, like, it makes sense to me. I mean, just from an engineering standpoint, it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So let's see here. I guess going way back to earlier in the conversation, what is it do you think that is unique about humans then, in terms of our self?
Well, I do think that what's unique about humans, I guess I don't like the question what's unique, because it seems to imply that there's something I do think that there's some degree of consciousness
Mm-hmm.
that is present um, in other animals. I do think that there is something unique in that I think it's a degree of order different in humans, that our ability to introspect and interact with the divine um, and be conscious about our decisions is orders of magnitude different than any other organism.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and anything we've been able to build, obviously anything we've been able to build or anything else like that. So, and I do think that's unique about us, and I do think that that's what what's mentioned, kind of, or referred to in Genesis, is like we're made in the image of God in that way, that we can introspect in ways that no other animal can,
Mm-hmm.
and actually in super interesting ways that we can establish causal relations between things that no other animal can, and no other machine can, and even other humans that they grew up without language, if they were isolated from other humans and that kind of stuff, it's really hard to do. Um, and I do think that there's something there. So I think that, like, what's different about us is it's the order of magnitude. It's a difference of um, it's like the difference between being able to do like basic arithmetic and vector calculus. Um, that it I don't know how else to explain it. The what we're doing is very different. It's not that other animals aren't conscious in some way or sentient in some way. Um, but chimps and gorillas and other primates and everything else like that they are not introspective in ways that humans are. They do not view themselves the same way we do. No psychological experiment bears that out. They
Right.
get jealous to a certain extent. They get greedy to a certain extent and that kind of stuff. But we have a conception of ourselves as being individuals, and having worth and that kind of stuff. And these are concepts that just aren't present in those organisms. So I think that there's a difference of kind. You could view it as a difference of magnitude, but yeah, it's a difference of intellect and will between us and our closest relatives. I call them that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I would agree with everything what you just said. It's a hard question. Like, I think that when I look at virtually every use of statistics or machine learning or AI that I've ever seen in healthcare, there's almost always a part of it that relies on a human to tell it the outcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the goal or something like that. And it's
Yeah,
almost
they're
always
human.
just
Yeah, we annotate the data. We tell it what's the
annotate the
right answer.
data, and it's almost always just improving its ability to replicate the behavior of something that humans are doing.
We told it to do. Yes.
Right. And even then, it's often doing a fractional version of that imitation, or the only part of the behavior that can be digitized and encoded to it in a way that it can interact with. And I'm not super abreast of all the latest AI research, but I haven't seen anything that seems to escape that problem, that the axiology or the ethics or whatever is something that AI can do itself, and it always seems to be almost parasitically dependent on a human for that sort of thing.
Yeah, the closest thing that I've come across, and I still don't think it escapes what you're pointing to, is I have a friend she's a Christian and she works at Google as an AI researcher, um, and she's researching creativity
Mm-hmm.
in AI, And so what she's doing is she's building AIs that build classical music, that composes classical music. And some of it is really good. Some of it, if you just played it for me, I would not know
Right.
that this was not composed by a human and a very talented human. Like it would pass. It
It's
would
the
pass.
Turing, the Mozart Turing test.
Yes, exactly. It would pass that test. It is being trained with human inputs
Right. It's
about what is good.
basically, it's being trained to imitate, to
Yes,
imitate a human definition of classical music.
exactly. And so it's creating something new, but it's creating something new based on what we've already given it, and what we've told is good and that kind of stuff. And it's establishing mathematical patterns, and creating something new that we may like. And sometimes it's garbage, but sometimes it's actually really good.
Mm-hmm.
And so the closest thing that I could come to of something that's escaping that would be that. But even then, it seems parasitic because you're still relying on humans to
Right.
tell you what's good and what's not, and to give you that feedback loop constantly. And so, yeah, I don't think that you're escaping that, really there. Um, I guess to Steelman the opposite argument, I think you could say, well, but how much of what you like and what you think is good is a result of something you came up with independently of the culture and the other people that you're around?
Right. Right.
And so, if you're developing art or you're writing music and that kind of stuff, aren't you constantly getting feedback loops from other people about what's good and what's bad and that kind of thing? And so to Steelman that, yeah, I mean, you're right. Like I'm not an island in that
Right.
sense. Um, but so that would be the Steelman the opposite point. But yeah, it's still parasitic. It's not coming up with it on its own, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, her research is very fascinating to me because that's not. I'm trying to predict. I'm trying to predict. Various other things related to healthcare, but um, she's trying to do some creative things, but it is still definitely kind of it's still dependent on humans to say, yes, that's good music. No, that's bad
Right.
music. Yeah.
Right. I took piano lessons from sort of a young age, and I can sort of feel and remember the transition from I'm playing to please my piano teacher and to follow her instructions, and she said, "Oh, I need to be quieter in this section, or I need to be more staccato with the notes in this section."
Okay.
To the transition of, oh, I kind of can feel inside myself the way I want it to sound and what's
Right.
the best to me, and sort of finishing the circle of feedback within my own musical taste and enjoyment. And
Yeah.
it still feels to me like I can't even imagine how AI could get that last piece. It's always
Right.
like a kid who's trying to please his piano teacher.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean that's certainly where we're at, and so that kind of continuous feedback loop. And again, I think that's the conscious introspection, though, that
Mhm.
that you're aware of what you're doing,
Right, right.
and the
And I'm
telos.
I'm experiencing the telos or
Yes.
the whatever
Right.
internalized classical music utility pleasure function or whatever it is.
What's that? Okay. Sorry. My wife's telling me to talk less loud. So,
I get
um,
that instruction a lot too. That's why I
yeah.
lock myself in the basement.
Yes. So, no, I think that's, um, yeah, that you're missing the telos, that you're missing the internal telos, that this is where I'm trying to go. And
Hmm.
without the introspection or the consciousness to say, like, I am my own, I am an individual trying to like accomplish this thing and that kind of stuff without the kind of introspection. I don't know how you would ever get to that telos, really. You could imitate it. You could imitate it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not you could ever actually get there, it's not clear to me that you ever could. And quite frankly, like, I don't know how electrons moving in a wire would ever produce it in that same way. Like, I don't know how random number generators would ever do it. And so that's where you could, but I do think that you could imitate it. And so that's where I think that we're too, some people are too pessimistic on where AI can go and what it can do and that kind of stuff, because I think we can imitate it, because really it's a probabilistic function in terms of how humans behave even.
Mm-hmm.
So, but whether or not we could ever get to true consciousness and creativity and that kind of stuff, as opposed to just an imitation of it, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that. I think categorically it's a different kind of thing. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. But that's my kind of, that's my perspective on it. It's an interesting conversation. I think that Vervaeke and those guys kind of they trivialize it. They just say, well, like machines can kind of learn, so that's clearly all our brain is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And like everything that we experience and all of our consciousness and qualia and everything else like that is just, it's just really produced by your brain. I guess no, I don't think so. I don't think that even like qualitatively, like we're talking about categorical problems here. I don't, your experience does not, your introspection does not boil down to neurons firing. That doesn't make sense,
Mm-hmm.
because no matter how I arrange the computer chip, I don't produce consciousness.
Right.
It's not.
Or at least we don't think so. And we probably have good reasons to not think so.
I mean, if we do, we have no reason to suspect that we have.
Right.
you know,
Right.
there's no reason to suspect so far that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So when Vervaeke says things like, "Oh, we have overwhelming evidence that your mind is just produced by your brain," you're like, "Overwhelming evidence? We have no evidence
Yeah.
of that, none whatsoever." And that's, in fact, we have opposite evidence. We have, one would think that we could, you know, one would think that even some things like the Leday experiment that we used to think was so sound in the 70s, where they were measuring brain waves and they told someone, okay, at some point, tap your finger. And so they had all these electrodes on the brain and everything else like that. And so they said, okay, well, at some point, tap your finger. And so they were measuring your brain waves and then the neurons leading down to your finger. And in the 70s, they ran these experiments and thought that, oh, well, your brain actually told your finger to tap before you consciously were aware that you were going to do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the person's report of their decision to tap their finger happened after their brain had already told their finger to tap.
Yeah.
And so that was like, for decades, people were touting this as an example of a
The
repudiation of free will,
yeah,
right?
that the I in the subject can be seen on a brainwave.
Right, exactly. And it's only with so in the last year though they shown that that's just completely not, that the experiment was flawed to the extent that it meant nothing, because if you told the person to, if you did the same thing, and you told the person to either not tap their finger or tap their finger, then the brain waves were very similar.
Right, right, right.
And so it's not as if you can just say, well, this is when you decided to, or this is when you didn't decided to, and I didn't decide to, and that kind of thing, because the the brainwave pattern was so similar between you deciding to or not deciding to. You can't really say, well, when did you decide
Right.
um, to do those kind of things? And so I don't think that um, I think that we've realized like in the last 15 years that it's way more you're way more complicated. Consciousness and your brain and everything else is way more complicated than we thought to, which makes sense because if you think about it, there are more potential neuronal connections end to end in your brain than there are uh, atoms in the universe. That's crazy.
That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy.
That is crazy, but it's absolutely true because of the exponential nature of neuronal connections and how many patterns you can make and everything else like that. But that's how many there are. So the idea that you could, oh, well, I just measured your brain and this is what you did. And so therefore, no, consciousness and free will is not a thing is silly. It's
Right.
silly on the face of it.
And it's
Um,
weird because the thing that would be understanding your consciousness would also theoretically need to be a consciousness itself. And
right.
then is it understanding itself? And then it's weird.
You get
Yeah.
yes, you get into again, you get into more subject predicate problems here.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
what is understanding what?
Yeah.
Um,
And that it goes recursively all the way down. Yeah.
exactly. And so at some point you're like, no, I don't think this is right. I don't think that the material is the bottom line here.
Right.
Um, and and so this is where I like the Aristotelian or the Thomistic framework, because you can say, listen, in that framework, you would still have neuronal connections. You would still see all these things happening on a material level, but there's a different level that is actually informing all of those things. And so it makes sense to me that because then the bottom level isn't the material, the bottom level is the immaterial, the subject, you, the person. And so then the question is, well, could we ever make a person that's made out of circuits and bits?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think so. I don't see how that's possible. But that would be the question. And so I don't think that you can. I think what they want to do is say, yes, because you are just your brain, therefore I can make another person that's just a machine. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to flip it and be like, are you so sure that you're just your brain? Are
Yeah.
you so sure about that?
So here's a question. I think I know one way to make a conscious agent, and that's standard human reproduction. So, so what? But that does bring up the question: what exactly is happening when a new human comes into existence?
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, again, in the Aristotelian framework, you would say, well, it's so Aristotle always talked about potentiality and actuality. Um, and so potentiality is potential. It's the ability to become a certain type of thing or produce a certain type of effect and that kind of thing. And so you have this principle of sufficient reason that it takes uh, an intellect to produce an intellect, that you can't derive an intellect from a non-intellect, for instance. So you need something at base. And so this is where Aristotle ended up at first cause, the uncaused cause. Even he was Greek, but he wasn't Christian or anything else like that. But that's how we ended up there, because he had this principle of sufficient cause, that you don't have um, you don't have things that lack a certain potentiality produce something else that is capable of it. So you don't have something that lacks intellect that's capable of producing something with intellect. And so um, here in reproduction, you would say, well, you have the potential and maybe even the actual intellect. Like you have that. And so you're capable of producing something that also has that. And we see this and so like Aristotle at heart was a biologist, so he would look at other species.
Right.
Bees have have an ability to produce other bees. Not something greater than a bee, not something that's like conscious and can do calculus or anything else like that. They have the ability to produce the bee. And so the question here is whether or not we as an intellect have the ability to produce something with an intellect via means other than the biological. Right. And so I think that's the interesting question. We do have that potentiality. We have the potential for intellect and consciousness and all those kind of things, and we exhibit it often. And in fact, we once you're grown, you've actualized that. So the question is whether or not we have the ability to produce it in means other than reproduction. And so that would be the Aristotelian thing. We're like, yes, what's happening there is you've produced something because you have that potential. You produce something else with also that potential. And you're doing it via biology, great. But so what's happening there is just that. Is you've produced something with that same thing, and that includes though the immaterial part of it, the form, the soul. You've produced that. You have that potential. And so then the question is, do you have the ability to produce that form, that kind of soul, without the biological component of it? Can I produce a computer with it? And that's where it becomes a little bit, that's where I think the answer is no. You don't have that ability. But that's what's going on, is that you're actually producing a soul. You're producing an immaterial form via reproduction that is in some ways produced. Your ability to produce it is because you also have that same form or potential. So you have the ability to produce it. And so, yeah, you have a new form, you have a new soul that's encapsulated in this little biological machine that's being built. So that would be the Thomistic framework and the Aristotelian framework. And I think that it makes some sense from a Christian perspective. So,
yeah. Although they could take the chain back to the uncaused mover, and inside that unmoved mover is potentials, or something like that, I presume.
Well, yeah. Well, all potentials derive from the unmoved mover, right? But that doesn't mean that everything that that is differentiated or kind of created from the unmoved mover like has all the potentials of the unmoved mover.
Right.
So so we would not have all the potentials of the unmoved mover. Neither would a chair, neither would a rock, neither would a tree, and that kind of stuff.
But nothing in creation has potential that isn't in the unmoved mover's
correct.
potential.
And that is actually part of Aquinas's 5 ways of proving God's existence. And so he talks about that, but then he talks about, okay, well, now that we prove God's existence, what is the nature of God? And that's where he talks about, okay, well, God has to be omnipotent, because no power that's present in the world doesn't derive from God, right? In that way, God is the cause of all powers in the world. In that way, God is all powerful. In that way, God is omnipotent. And so you go through Aquinas's arguments in that way. So like no knowledge in the world is derived from anything other than God, because how could it be? Because God is the first, the unmoved mover, and that kind of stuff. And so then therefore, if God encompasses all knowledge, then God is therefore omniscient. There's no place in the universe that God hasn't caused to be. In that way, God is present everywhere. In that way, God is omnipresent. And so you go through all these things, these categories of God. So yes, you're all borrowing back to that mover in that sense. That doesn't mean you have all of those aspects. And so if you are not omnipresent, then whatever you produce also can't be omnipresent.
Right.
If you're not omnipotent, nothing you can produce is actually omnipotent.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and just because you are something doesn't mean that you can produce anything else via any means either. And so it doesn't follow that just because you're conscious that you can produce a conscious thing by any means, or you might not be able to produce it at all. And so it just means that something that's not conscious can't produce something that is conscious. And so that's where the Aristotelian, you have to, you have to follow that chain and see like what the genus and species of all my kind of potentialities and actualities would have to like play themselves out before we figure out like what am I capable of producing, and then what kind of things am I trying to produce, and am I capable of producing it in like kind of what we'll call artificial ways, such
Right.
as writing code.
Right. So there's obviously something pretty anti-evolutionary about that. Whereas I know that Esther is not a big fan of evolutionary theory,
Sure.
but it seems like if we do buy into evolutionary theory, then it seems like, well, vegetative souls did at some point give rise to animal souls, which did at some point give rise to rational souls, if I'm getting my Aristotelian hierarchy of souls in proper order.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that what you would have to say is actually that you would I think what you would have to say is that God intervened in those instances, that those kind of new souls. So this is where like the teleological like the theistic evolution would come in, and like Edward Fazer and some of the other guys would say, well, here's the thing: you're all borrowing from God in that sense. And so if you want to call it intervention, we can, but it doesn't proceed naturally from atoms making life, and life making vegetation, and vegetation making animals, and whatever it is, like however we want to construct the tree. So you would say, well, we're all borrowing from God, and at some point God is intervening. Okay, I think Edward Fazer's critique would be, listen, just because God is intervening in a metaphysical sense doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a material description of what that looked like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so that's where I think that sometimes the the intelligent design folks go wrong. That they get out of the mathematical description of what like irreducible complexity looks like, and those kind of things, and they get into something more like philosophy. And I think that I would say that what they're doing, they're just going too far. I think that what their critiques are good insofar as it goes, but even in an Aristotelian or a Thomistic framework, you would say, listen, I still expect there to be a material causal chain here. But there might be a metaphysical intervention here to produce something greater than what was there before.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
can we ever see evidence left behind of metaphysical intervention, or would that be sort of the same trap or problem of trying to prove God?
I mean, it depends on what you say. Like, it depends on what you mean by evidence.
Right. Fair
And
enough.
so, yeah, and so like that's where it gets like really, it gets really interesting. No, I mean, I don't think that we would ever see physical evidence if we're going to really reduce it down to that. However, I do think that the ID guys are actually uncovering real metaphysical evidence, because what they're doing is they're saying, listen, mathematically, this doesn't make sense. Like, mathematically, this would not have happened, but it somehow did. And so I think that, like, if you want call that a miracle, I don't know, but like clearly physically it did happen.
Right.
But it's so unlikely as a pattern, as a mathematical pattern, that like there's the likelihood that this particular set of genetic mutations or whatever would have happened within this time span, there's just not enough time for it to happen. But clearly it did.
Right.
Clearly it did. So what are we to say?
So then it's a probabilistic argument at best. But,
I think so. Yeah. I don't know where, like, how you would get to anything other than than that, because at some point, I mean, the nature of what we're claiming is such that there's not going to be a physical thing that you're going to be able to point to.
Right. There won't be like a signature, God did this here, or something like that.
The sign that we're going to all agree on. No, that's not the kind of thing that we're talking about. And so, so I don't think that that's not what we're getting to, but I think what we're getting to is like something metaphysically happened here. And like the material description, fine. I have no qualms with your description of what happened in the past. I have no qualms with like your past description of the fossil record, and this one is related, this animal is related to this one, and we and chimps share kind of a common ancestor, if you want to call it that, and that kind of stuff. But at some point it becomes kind of meaningless to me, because
interesting.
I don't think that what you're talking about is, I don't think that the mechanisms that you're talking about are, you're restricting yourself to just the material causation description, which is not super interesting to me. And again, Aristotle had 4 different types of causes, right? So
right. Yeah, I couldn't name all 4. I know one is final and one is material, and then there's 2 other ones. Like
formal,
efficient.
yes, formal, final, efficient, and material are the 4. And so you're describing just one of those.
Right.
Very good. That's fine.
And it's like what we were saying about mind earlier, that describing neurons and that sort of thing is only one layer of the cake.
Right.
And leaving many of the 3 other layers, and perhaps the most important layer, off the table, and somehow thinking that we don't need that because we have a good enough
that's like
cause.
That's like me. If I asked you, if someone asked me, like, how did you get to work today? And I just gave them a line by line description of the atoms that were bouncing around in my brain, and down to my arms and my legs and everything else. So like, well, atom 1 did this, and atom 2 did that, and atom 3 did this, and whatever. And I gave you that description. It wouldn't answer the question of how I got to work today.
Right.
You would say, well, but if I told you, actually, I, the form, decided via an act of will to drive my car to work today in order to get to my job. Like, I've described formal, efficient, and final cause, and I've completely left out the material.
Right.
In that description.
And maybe your car was the sum total of the material, or
Yes, exactly. And so it's not that the material is completely absent, but like I didn't really mention the material at all. And so which is more informative?
Right.
Which statement or description has more information than the other? And we would say, well, actually the latter has more information. I didn't like, even though like you might have, you could put like, 1,000 volumes of all the atoms that were interacting and all the descriptions of what happened in between me getting up in the morning and me going to work, but it doesn't describe, it doesn't contain nearly as much information,
Right.
really, as what I just said. Again, this was my point in my thesis. Okay, if that's true, what does that say about our model? Is that we're missing most of the information.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that me giving a model of light as a particle is missing the information of me giving up the experiment data from light behaving like a wave.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's true, we should really rethink that model. And this is
Right.
where I go back to Aristotle, because he was completely unwilling to get rid of those models. That like, this is information. This is like, I can't describe these things just purely materially and contain all of the information. So my causal system needs to be more encompassing than that. And that's where I get back to that. You're saying, no, I'm sorry. Like, you giving me the material causal chain doesn't answer my question.
Right.
It doesn't. It doesn't describe the system. It's a bad model. No models are true. Some models are useful. That's a useful model only insofar as I'm a neuroscientist or something like that, but it's not useful outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not true. So we shouldn't take it as all encompassing. And that's what I see like Vervaeke and a lot of these guys doing is reducing it down and acting as if that's the entirety of the model.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's right. I don't think it's philosophically warranted. And I think there's a reason that guys like Aquinas and Aristotle rejected that.
Yeah. And I think that we see that in artificial intelligence. It's like artificial intelligence really only is operating at the material cause level. It doesn't have the ability to determine a T-loss or a purpose, or to intuit what the T-loss of some other system that we can observe is, the way we can, and then even to choose among possible T-losses and purposes and decide to act in that direction. That's the thing that it's always parasitically aping. It's funny that we use that word. It's aping us in terms of our ability to do that, and we don't have the faintest clue about how to build that, it seems to me.
No, of course, no, we don't. We try to. Yes, we're constantly trying to ape it, in the sense that we're trying to get it to mimic what we're doing, even when we're making those kind of like intuitive choices. But then we just give it more information, and then more, here's what I would have done in that situation.
Right.
So in that sense, we're always aping. It's always derivative of
Yeah.
what we're doing. And
in some ways, it can exceed the capabilities of an individual human, because it can do something a million times, where in an hour, where we can only do it 1,000 times in a lifetime.
Yeah,
So
well, there's only so
in some respect, but it's still relying and derivative upon the T-loss that a human gave it to do so.
It can learn from a million. If you look at like oncology, it can learn from a million cases of pancreatic cancer or whatever it is.
Right.
And like a doctor can never do that, right? A doctor
But a
can't.
doctor tells it that that's a pancreatic cancer slide.
Exactly. You're learning from the sum total of other humans and that kind of stuff. So it can be better only because it's learning from the sum total of all of human experience.
Right.
But that's not the same thing as being human.
Right.
And that's where like we're really being flippant about the entire conversation. I think to think that, oh, because it can be better than us here, therefore it is us, or it can be reduced to us, or and that kind of stuff. And you're like, no, that's a non sequitur. That's really bad philosophy, actually. just because you can ape us in a certain situation, or even you can do better than an individual human, that doesn't mean that what you're doing is the same as what a human's doing.
Right, right.
So
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing. And I think a lot of it just gets muddled because we use this word intelligence. And it's like the things that make us human and special are intelligence. And it's intelligent and it's more intelligent, so therefore it's better than us. And it's like that's missing so much of the complexity that it's so misleading.
yeah, and that's why I like to separate out whenever I talk about this, like what's different about you than when I do talk about this, what's different about you versus an AI, or or what makes an AI artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And I always like to say, listen, I like to think of intelligence as ability to learn. And so in that sense, an AI is intelligent.
Sure.
It can learn. You, however, are conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different than what the AI is doing. The way that you learn is, in some ways similar, like some of the same ways you learn, we can mimic in AIs and that kind of stuff, but we can't mimic your consciousness and your learning. That is one of the real ways that you learn, is by conscious introspection on real things and the real nature of reality, and not just like patterns.
Right. We
And
can determine that there's this pattern out there called pancreatic cancer, and we can decide that even though everyone's pancreatic cancer is different, there's still some uniting thing that's pancreatic cancer, and that we don't like it, and that we're going to get good at recognizing this pattern and do something about it. And then we can employ artificial intelligence to be like, okay, here's things that 100,000 doctors labeled as pancreatic cancer over the course of their careers. Now you learn all of that experience, and then you'll be superhuman. But it didn't decide that pancreatic cancer was a thing, or even what it was, or that we should care about it.
it has no idea.
Yeah.
It's a fancy prediction algorithm. That's all it is.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, people really oversell. I mean, I think it has great, both productive and destructive capabilities in like the modern economy. And so I'm not one to say like, oh, there's nothing here, there's nothing to pay attention to and that kind of stuff. But like, if you're worried about Skynet or something like that, I don't know what to tell you, because that's that's not what we're building, guys.
Yeah, I can't even get this thing to clean its own data. So
It's like, yes, totally. I was like, do you know, like, it takes me 3 days to tune the algorithm. It takes me 4 weeks to just clean the data to get it to be able to use the data. So like, that's most of our job, is just to like get the data in a place where it even knows how to handle it. So it's really nowhere near taking over the planet, for sure.
yeah. Although that cleaning data process gives us plenty of time to listen to podcasts.
Well, that's the thing. I always like, hey, my back propagation algorithm's like training, so I'm listening to more Paul Vanderklay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny. All right. Well, it's getting kind of late here. So I should probably wrap this up and head to bed myself.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's getting late here. I've got 2 kids, and one will be up very early, I'm sure. So.
Sure. All right. So I'll stop the recording